My name is Isabella O'Donnell-Silfverberg, and this interview is part of the True Kids One Democracy Project, in which we're talking to a bunch of different people to get a sense of what's going on politically and economically in the world, in Taos and the rest of the world. So we've already interviewed some major players in the politics of our town, including our mayor, some state representatives and legislators. And now we are changing our focus to a more global scale and talking to James Leitner, who has some insight on the current situation in Ukraine. So welcome, Jim, and we're very excited to be speaking with you today.
Hi, Isabella. I'm super happy to be here.
So your relationship with Russia goes back to the 1990s when the country was undergoing some huge economic and political changes. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you were involved in that and what you did and what was the result?
Sure. So my background had been economics and finance. And when I was in college, I really enjoyed studying Russian politics. And in those days, it was called Soviet politics and Soviet history. And I did Russian as my foreign language requirement. So when things started changing in the Soviet Union in 1990, I became very interested in finding out what was going on because I had done all this academic research. And, I had always thought that it'd be interesting to know if markets would act better with democracy rather than with autocracy. So when the system changed in Russia and it became clearly much more democratic in the 1990s from what it had been before, so from 1990 till about 2000, it was quite democratic and people were voting and there was lots going on. I decided that I had to go there and check things out. And, I decided that this was a country I wanted to invest in because people were so excited about democracy that I felt that they could only do better. When people are allowed to work together and communicate together and explore the world together and try to build a country, I figured they would do a good job. And during that period of time, exciting things happened in Russia.
Based on your time and work spent in Russia, and probably spending some time getting to know Russian people, would you say that the general attitudes in this country are such that they would reach a tipping point where they would go against the government or what the media is feeding them?
There have been quite a few demonstrations all across Russia. And Russia is a very authoritarian state, and the police have arrested thousands of people and put them in jail. Now, at thousands of people, you can still arrest them. At hundreds of thousands, you can't anymore. And it just depends how long the war drags on, how bad the situation gets for the Russian population to see if more people will come out onto the street and start demonstrating. I mean, the Russian media, of course, is dominated by the Russian government. So they're not allowed to use the word war in Russia. So it's just a special military operation. It is not a war. And if you use the word war, you can be accused of anti-government activities and put in jail for even using that word. The other thing that I've noticed is that, parents in Russia are also asking school boards and teachers, how do I talk to my kids about what's happening? They have brothers or sons who are in the Russian military and they end up in the Ukraine. How do I talk to my other kids about that? And the answer that has been given by the Russian Ministry of Education or by the school boards has been, just listen to what President Putin says. He has given a couple of speeches about what's going wrong in Ukraine and how Ukraine has become a neo-Nazi society and how it is totally corrupt and how they are suppressing Russian speakers in the Ukraine and how we Russians need to help our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. Well, those are the speeches you need to listen to, and don't worry about anything else, because what the government tells you is the correct way to think about this military incursion.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm happy to say that in our country, we don't need to do that. Like when you're asking me all these questions, it's because you were able to do research, right? You were looking across the internet and you looked at what happened in the 1990s in Russia, and you've done research on the sanctions, and you've done research on the Ukraine. And being able to do that is kind of very special.
Right. Yeah, it's a privilege we have by having a more free internet. So you spoke earlier outside of this interview about what people in Lebanon are experiencing right now as a result of supply chains being cut off with food shortages, and how that's going to be an increasing problem. So it's easier to see how this war is going to affect countries that are in a closer proximity to Ukraine and Russia. But just with your perspective, what do you think some of the implications could be for us here, not only in this country, but specifically in New Mexico, or in smaller towns? What can people expect?
Directly, it doesn't affect us immediately. Like, the reason Lebanon is affected is that 90% of the grain that they use to make breads come from Russia or the Ukraine. In the middle of the war, it's really hard to export your grain to Lebanon. Or for Turkey, it's 60%. And for Egypt, it's over 60%. And there are riots in the streets and long, long lines because food prices are really expanding. We're not seeing that in the US yet. But the one thing that we can see is that there's a common humanity, so that we need to care about Ukrainians the same way we would care about our neighbors just down the street in Valdez. If there's a natural disaster, if we have a drought, should people care about us? Yes, they should care about us the same way we should be caring about this disaster. Now, this disaster is man-made. It started with an aggressive, illegal war by Russia. Mm-hmm. But, it's affecting people, it's affecting humans. And the way I think we need to think about it is that people matter. It doesn't matter where they are. It doesn't matter if they're your neighbor, or if they're a town over, or if they're a country over. The same way you might have felt, when the hurricanes hit Puerto Rico. Well, that wasn't exactly your neighbor, but you did care when you saw the pictures. Mm-hmm. And caring about Ukraine in the same way, I think, is really important. I think it's important for us to never lose our humanity, and to remember that, we could be in the same situation. In certain ways, we're just lucky about where we were born, right? We didn't choose that. We could have been born anyplace else, or as in a different situation.
Right. So besides, keeping our humanity and caring for people, what are some direct actions that you think people in this country can take to try to aid this situation? But there's pressuring the media, and there's signing petitions and sending money. But what do you see as some of the most effective measures people here can take?
It's not that much we can do, except write to our political representatives and speak to them that we think Ukrainians need help and assistance, whether it's today or after the war ends. They're going to need an enormous amount of help. Mm-hmm. And, as a country, we are super, super endowed and wealthy, and we should be planning on the future and figuring out what we can do today to make this war shorter, and what we can do once the war ends to help Ukraine rebuild. There are also many ways of just standing with Ukrainians. I've been at a demonstration a week ago where we were all standing and listening to Ukrainian poetry and holding candles. And, the more people around the world tell the Russians, who obviously know that this is happening, that, you're on the wrong side of history, the quicker it may end. Will it be very effective? I don't know. And then there are other small things one can do, like sending a little bit of money. If you have a little bit, you can send a little bit. I mean, there are people who have been renting Airbnb rooms in the Ukraine and calling the host and saying, I only did that so I could send you some money. I'm not planning on being there, but I want you to use that money so that you have something to allow you to buy some food, or if you escape to Poland, that you have some money.
Mm-hmm.
So that
sorry, go ahead.
No. So there have been interesting ways of doing that. And there's a blog by a Yale professor named Tim Snyder. On his blog, he has quite a few organizations that he says are worth supporting, that he's researched and made sure that they're not, scams where people are trying to get you to send something and then, it's just being taken away by con artists, because that's obviously one of the fears one has.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up here, you were talking about helping Ukrainians plan for the future, and the people who need to plan for the future most, the more future you need to plan for, the younger you are. So what can Ukrainian youth right now expect as a result of this war when they reach financial maturity, when they start having to be financially independent? What will the effects be 10 years down the line for people who are trying to start businesses and buy homes, people who are kids now? What should they keep in mind?
I think it's really a hard question, because we don't even know what the world would look like in 10 years, right? You don't even know what your world would look like in 10 years with climate change and, the politics in this country. So I think the only advice one can have for everybody is to be curious and try to keep learning and try to have an open mind, because I think curiosity allows you to go with the flow, to learn something, to reinvent yourself, to always follow your passions, because we don't know what exactly these Ukrainian kids will need 10 years from now, or what you will need 10 years from now. But, the most we can do is create systems that allow people to be successful as quickly and as effectively as possible.
Right. So while we're still here with you, is there anything else you'd like to discuss? Anything else you think is super important that we haven't covered yet?
I think that, one of the things that these disasters like this war shows us, that it's like throwing a stone in the pond. You have a big splash, but then you have little waves that travel all around the world. And so like this idea that, because food prices are skyrocketing, suddenly you have riots on the street in Lebanon, that's not something that's obvious. And I think one of the ways we have to stay critically engaged is to always think about the other effects. It's not just the one thing that we're looking at, but how does it affect others down the road that we may not have thought about initially? It wasn't the first thing I thought about when I heard, oh my God, Russia has just invaded Ukraine. I didn't think about, they're wheat exporters, and I wonder what's going to happen to the wheat. But, as I started reading about the Ukraine and looking at blogs, I started thinking, what about the farmers? Are they going to go out there and plant? Probably not if they're in the middle of a war. What's that going to do? And clearly, I think it's important to always do that. And I think it's important to follow the world, not just through one lens, not just through politics, not through only history, not only through economics, but to be open to influences from all of those, like to read literature about something that you care about. So I've read a lot of Russian and Ukrainian literature, or I read history books and psychology books, and I read about economics. And I think, in our situation where you are in school, you still are lucky you have so many more years ahead of you that you can read and study and allow your brain to just take in so much, so many interesting things in the world.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's all.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking to you. This is the latest installment in the True Kids One Democracy Project. We've been talking to James Leitner, who has a unique perspective on the current situation between Russia and Ukraine. So thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Isabella.
Thank you, James.